Good evening, everybody. Is this thing live? Oh, I think we got a few desert rats out here tonight. It's good to see you all. I'm Steve Davis. I'm the curator for the Southwestern Writers Collection here at the Wittliff Collections. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our panel discussion on the Big Bend this evening. And when you think about Big Bend, one thing you could think about is that Elizabeth Taylor died last week. And
The Giant.
one of her great roles was in Giant, filmed out in Marfa in 1955. And for those of us who are interested in Texas literature, when you think about Giant, that brings to mind Billy Lee Bramer's classic novel, The Gay Place, which was published 50 years ago. And Bramer was a young reporter at the newly formed Texas Observer when he drove out to Marfa to write about the making of Giant. And those experiences he had reporting there helped inspire his great novel. And here at the Wittliff Collections, we found that many writers and photographers have been inspired by the Big Bend region over the decades. And we've gathered several of them together for our exhibit, Big Bend, Land of the Texas Imagination. And we've gathered several of the cream of the crop here this evening for our panel discussion. In the audience tonight, we have several donors, friends who have given archives and contributed financially, all of which helps these collections grow and flourish. And I'd like to mention that 2011 marks the 25th anniversary of the Wittliff Collections, and we're poised to make great strides into the future, collecting, preserving, and making available the finest artistic representations of Texas and the Southwest. And we do need your help to continue with this important work, so please consider joining us as we continue our mission. I'd also like to take, now that I've done the public service announcement, a moment to recognize our founding donors, Bill and Sally Wittliff, who are here this evening. Bill, Sally, how are you? There they are, way in the back. And also tonight, I believe I saw Jim Sanderson here. Jim is a wonderful Texas writer who has published 2 very fine novels set in Big Bend. Jim is also a donor to the Wittliff Collections, and if you've seen the exhibit we have on Big Bend, we feature Jim as part of that. Jim, thank you for your donations. We appreciate that. It's good to have you here. And it was a special delight to see that our longtime director, recently retired, Connie Todd, is here. Connie, it's great to have you back. Welcome. And now it's my honor to briefly introduce our distinguished guests. First, our moderator this evening, Mr. Jake Silverstein, who many of you know as the editor of Texas Monthly. What some of you might not know is that Jake is a former reporter for the Big Bend Sentinel, a newspaper based in Marfa. And while living in Marfa, Jake was also writing some terrific stories for Harper's Magazine. Jake earned his MFA in creative writing from UT Austin's Michener Center for Writers, and in 2006 he joined Texas Monthly as senior editor. In 2008 he became editor. Jake and his staff produce a magazine that is national in quality and yet focuses on Texas. I mean, how cool is that? And under Jake's direction, Texas Monthly is continuing to diversify and strengthen its coverage of all of Texas. The magazine has won 2 National Magazine Awards in each of the first 2 years that Jake took over, one for general excellence and the other for feature writing. Jake is also the author of this recently published book, Nothing Happened and Then It Did, a chronicle in fact and fiction. This is a very funny and a very thoughtful book that follows the adventures of a young journalist, coincidentally named Jake Silverstein, who gets a reporting job in Marfa, Texas, while searching for his first big breakthrough story. Jake, like Billy Lee Bramer before him, found literary gold in Marfa. Jake's book is available for purchase this evening, so you can buy a copy courtesy of our university bookstore, and Jake has agreed to stay and sign copies after the program. So we're delighted that you're here moderating, Jake. Please join me giving him a warm welcome. Also with us, we have Dr. Barney Nelson, a professor at Sul Ross State University in Alpine, who is also an accomplished writer and photographer. Barney earned her PhD from the University of Nevada, Reno, and she publishes books on rural folks, particularly cowboys, and that's the focus of her writing and photography. Barney is published in numerous magazines, including Texas Monthly, and her work has also appeared in many anthologies. She's received many honors, including being inducted into the Big Bend Hall of Fame and having the 10th annual Cowboy Poetry Gathering dedicated to her. Dr. Nelson's books include Voices and Visions of the American West. This is a really beautiful coffee table book that was published by Texas Monthly Press. Her other books, among her other books, is The Last Campfire, The Life Story of Ted Gray. Does anybody here know Ted Gray? He's a Big Bend legend who passed away recently. A few years ago, Barney put together this excellent anthology. It's called God's Country or the Devil's Playground, the best nature writing from the Big Bend of Texas. This book is on display in our exhibit, and again, this is being sold this evening if you'd like to have your copy signed. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Barney Nelson. We also have Marcos Paredes, a longtime river ranger at Big Bend National Park, recently retired. Ranger Paredes has spent years patrolling the river by canoe and the desert by horseback, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who knows the area better. Marcos has a reputation for being able to handle anything that comes up, from rescue operations to drug interdictions to cross-border relations. And in his spare time, he's been involved in environmental efforts to help protect Big Bend. During his career, Marcos has guided many scientists, photographers, and writers into the backcountry, including Nick Patoski and Laurence Parent, and also Gary Cartwright of Texas Monthly, who profiled Marcos and his mustache in his 1985 story, I Was a Dude on Tumbling Mare Mountain. Marcos has also been immortalized in fiction. A recent novel by Nevada Barr. Do any of you here read Nevada Barr's books? These are the mysteries that are set in our national parks. They're very well done. Her one on Big Bend is called Borderline, and it features a major character who bears some striking resemblances to Ranger Paredes, right down to the famous mustache. Nevada Barr's acknowledgments for the book contain a special shout-out to Ranger Paredes. She writes, and this is a quote, "For humor, inspiration, attitude, and knowledge of the river, I will always be grateful to Marcos Paredes, Big Bend's River Ranger." Marcos, we're also grateful that you made this long trip to come here this evening. Thank you for being with us. My pleasure. We also have tonight Laurence Parent, long regarded as one of Texas's leading nature photographers. Laurence comes by this naturally. His father was National Park Service ranger and a gifted photographer, and his mother was a writer who published many articles on travel in magazines. Laurence spent his childhood in several southwestern states, going on numerous hiking and camping trips with his parents. And then he grew up and tried to rebel. I guess you're rebelling. He got his petroleum engineering degree from UT in 1981. Toiled for 6 long years as an engineer before chucking it and quitting to become a full-time freelance photographer and writer, specializing in landscape, travel, and nature subjects. I bet your mom and dad are very proud. Laurence lives in Wimberley with his wife, Dr. Patricia Parent, who is a faculty member here at Texas State. Patricia, are you here? Hey. She teaches in our political science department here. Lawrence's photographs are collected worldwide, and he's the author of many books, including several books of photography, hiking guides to Texas and New Mexico, scenic drives books for many states, books on national parks, including several on Big Bend. I even have a few of them here. These are the ones being sold this evening. Hiking Big Bend National Park, indispensable guide. Laurence and Joe Nick have collaborated on these 2 beautiful books from UT Press, Texas Mountains. Any of you have this book? Isn't it amazing? Especially if you wonder what those mountains on private land are like. This is kind of a behind-the-scenes tour. And most recently, Big Bend National Park was their collaboration, which kind of helped inspire the exhibit and event that we're having. These are all for sale. And Lawrence's recent book, This is kind of an interesting one. Death in Big Bend. Real stories of death and rescue in Big Bend National Park. So,
Yeah, Marcos is a star in it.
Marcos is the star in the book. I'm not surprised. Marcos is the medic. You were a medic at the park for the least.
Body recovery.
Body recovery, yeah. Yeah. So, Laurence, you will also sign books this evening, I believe.
Yeah.
So please join me in welcoming Laurence Parent. And now to our final panelist, Nick Patoski, one of the great writers of Texas and a great friend to the Wittliff Collections. Nick is a leading expert on Texas music. In addition to his hundreds of magazine stories on the subject, he has written the definitive biographies of Stevie Ray Vaughan, Selena, and most recently, Willie Nelson. Nick is also one of the leading nature and environment writers in Texas. He's published numerous articles, as well as co-authoring 3 books with Laurence Parent that Nick will also be signing this evening. Nick is a senior editor at Texas Monthly for many years. We're very glad that he and Jake are teaming up this evening. It's nice to see this kind of mini Texas Monthly reunion of sorts. And at the Monthly, we have many of those archives from Nick. You can really see kind of the breathtaking versatility of his writing. This is a guy who, in addition to reporting on music and the environment, could write very knowledgeably of politics, movies, sports, the media, barbecue, road trips, cowboy boots, civil rights, storm chasers, the Republic of Texas standoff in West Texas, and here in San Marcos, near and dear to our own hearts, the retirement of Ralph the Swimming Pig from Ocarina Springs. And that one was called, I think, Oinks for the Memories. Did you write that headline, Nick?
God bless Ralph.
Nick also publishes in National Geographic, Texas Parks and Wildlife Magazine, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, and The Village Voice. He's currently finishing what you can bet will be the definitive book on the Dallas Cowboys. Is there a pub date on that yet?
Not yet. The manuscript's not in yet. So
No, okay. But it's getting,
once that comes in, we'll get
it's okay for me to mention that you're working on it?
It's coming.
Good. Good. Well, keep your eyes
And
open.
will better come.
So those of you who had a chance to look at the exhibit, you'll see pretty much an entire case that's devoted to Nick Patoski and his writings on the subject. And that's kind of a no-brainer because Nick is one of the major donors to the Wittliff Collections. We hold his entire writing archive here. It's about 300 boxes, and those amount to incredibly rich. Come on, Nick. This is a, and I'll give you a quick example. Nick did the book on Selena. It was an unauthorized biography because he couldn't agree with her father who wanted to have the final cut on the book. And so he was barred from speaking to anybody in the Quintanilla family, anybody who had any association or any interest in the family. So Nick is a long-time experienced reporter with many, many contacts, just basically worked his ass off and talked to everybody he could about Selena and did these wonderful interviews that he saved. And one person in particular he talked to is Laura Canales, who is about 15, 20 years older than Selena, maybe. She was kind of a groundbreaking figure in Tejano music. She was kind of a lone woman in this very male-dominated industry. And she did this long interview with Nick where she described her experiences in that world during the 1970s, basically. And, of course, he could only use a few sentences from that interview in the book because the book was about Selena. But the people who come here and do research find this rich trove of information on Laura Canales, all the people Nick interviewed for that book, for Stevie Ray Vaughan, for Willie Nelson. It's really a pretty incredible resource. And when you consider all the different topics he's written on and this work and research that goes into them, it's a really pretty amazing archive. So thank you for letting me say that, Nick. I know you're embarrassed.
Thank you for taking my boxes.
So really, our lives here are much richer for Nick's presence, and I'd like to present you with a small gift that we have from the Wittliff as a symbol of our gratitude. This is an official acid-free archives box. It's created especially for you by our lead archivist, Katie Salzman. With
I'm
loving
sorry what
hands.
I've done to you all.
But you might want to look inside. Acid-free to protect the paper. So Nick's stuff gets very good care once it comes here. Before it comes here, not so good.
Dare I? It's awfully heavy. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, a horny toad.
This is created by the artist David Everett in Austin, especially for you.
I will thank you so much. I will never again say you can't find horny toads anywhere in Texas again. There's always going to be one close to me, and really, thank you. This is
Thank you, Jim.
This is wonderful. Thank you.
I think we're ready to roll. Thanks.
Wow.
Thank you, Steve, for that introduction excuse me a second, for all of us. And you know, we're gonna have kind of a wide-ranging discussion tonight about Big Ben, and we'll, you know, when I say Big Ben, I think we're gonna probably start by trying to talk about the park, but of course then that'll expand into the place even beyond the park, and maybe we'll even talk a little bit about how you define Big Ben itself. But before we even get into any of our discussion, I just want to say personally how honored I am to share the stage with these folks who know so much about this place that is so special and dear to, I assume, all of you in the room, and I know it's true for myself. I consider myself a mere novice in terms of my experience of that area. I did write for the newspaper out there, the Big Ben Sentinel, but just for a couple of years, and so it is an honor to be up here among the wealth of experience. Imagine the years and the hours of time spent observing this place that we have here with these four people. So I just want to personally give them a hand. And thank them again for being here. I know two of you, Laurence and Joe Nick, didn't have to travel very far to get here. But our other panelists had to actually log some miles to get down here, so that's also very appreciated that you came all the way out here from Alpine. Is that right, Professor Nelson, in your case? And
yes, and you all, when you come to the Big Ben, you tell stories about getting lost and all that sort of thing. Well, when we go home, we tell stories about, you know, getting lost in the city.
and Ranger Paredes, you've come in all the way from Big Ben now.
Terlingua. Yeah.
Terlingua, okay.
That's Big Ben.
That is a long trip. So, seriously, thank you. So I thought we'd start off, like I said, by I wanted to talk first a little bit with all of you about the park itself. And you know, as I said, you've all spent so much time there. You've all seen it over so many years. But I wonder if each of you could try to take us back to some of your very first experiences with that landscape and with that place, and talk a little bit about, you know, it first making its claim on you, you know, because that place does really make a claim on folks, and clearly it has on all of you who've spent so much time there. And maybe, Laurence, we could start with you, and since you're sitting right next to me.
My first time at the park was as a kid. We were living at Carlsbad Caverns at the time. I was pretty small kid, actually, and my parents took me down, and we camped up in the basin, and I don't know, I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, so I don't remember it all that well, but I remember an owl hooting all night right outside our little pop-up trailer, and it drove my dad nuts because he was kind of a light sleeper. So that's kind of my main memory from my first trip.
An owl hooting.
Yeah,
That's-
an owl
that's
hooting
what-
to
that's
keep
what
my
stuck
dad
with you.
awake all night, yeah. I didn't go again until... It seemed like we usually went north and west for vacations, but I didn't go again until I was in college at UT, and a girlfriend and I went out there several times and backpacked up to the South Rim, did the Lost Mine Trail, a lot of the normal sort of stuff, and I've kind of been going back ever since.
And how about you, Dr. Nelson? Could you talk about the way the place put its claws into you?
Well, I guess you're talking about Big Ben Park.
Yes.
I guess my first experiences there were at the Chisos Remuda with Buck Newsom, who was even before Lynn Carter had that. 'Cause my experiences all over that country have been horseback, and so I have been on all the trails and on some that were never open to most people. We just kind of go around the barriers, and, like Edward Abbey, and so most of my early experiences were around a campfire. You know, we used to be able to have fires there and just do almost anything we wanted to do. And I guess it was just real similar to the experiences all over West Texas. Desert, dark skies, lots of stars, and pretty country.
Now, when I noticed in your book, you define Big Bend, and you mentioned that people define it a couple different ways, and you said we're talking about the park.
Yeah, to
here,
me, the
but-
Big Bend is west of the Pecos. Of course, you don't ever cross the Pecos, if you're from West Texas. And, on up into the Guadalupes, and then we don't quite include El Paso, but get close there, and then both sides of the river, Coahuila and Chihuahua, and
a much bigger
a much bigger
part
area.
of than yeah.
And I even said this morning, which maybe I shouldn't say, but I guess that's what you want us to do, is talk about it. I've even often considered the park itself kind of the hole in the donut, that the rest of it is the Big Bend, and that always seemed like a little different place that is set apart, and it's not the local people, and although there were a few that were there.
A lot of tourists go there.
A lot of
You mean
tourists.
a hole in the donut because people aren't actually living
Yeah,
there
it's
anymore?
it's a government place that's run differently, and different perspective, different values, different. So the Big Bend to me is all of it.
Well, we'll come back to some of those ideas, but I do want to hear from each of you on this first question. Should Joe Nook, maybe you could talk a little bit about how the place first caught you?
1958, December. I was living in Fort Worth, and my father I think I was 7 years old. My father took my sister and I on a trip to Real, Texas. We went to the Alamo in San Antonio, and I was crushed. I mean, I had a Davy Crockett outfit when I turned 5. I'd visited Fess Parker's parents. I mean, I was so nuts about it. When I saw the real thing, it was like, it was diminished. It was in the middle of a city. And then we drove out west, spent the night in Marathon, and the next day went to the park. And it was the first time in my life that I saw the Texas that I'd always imagined. I mean, and just the two things I can remember, I mean, this is city folks coming to the national park, going up to the basin, sitting there in that dining room, and I was just taken with the window and the whole idea of the window and what it looked out on. And then at some point while I was there, I got real excited because I was told one of these mountain ranges on the edge of the park were the Christmas Mountains. And this was December, and it was right before Christmas. So it just basically, it looked like I'd kind of imagined reading about Pecos Bill and things like that. This was that place. And the rest of Texas had never really lived up to those things. I mean, yes, there's great qualities, but this looked like it was supposed to. And Dr. Nelson, it's interesting what you were saying about the donut hole, because the longer I've come out, the more I've been able to see that. And I think Billy Pat McKinney told me over in the Del Carmen, he said, you can go to some places in Marathon, you mentioned the national park, people don't look at you very kindly. And then he paused and he said, like my family. And if you look at the map of the park, there's McKinney Flats. And so there was a contentious history before I got there and saw it as a national park visitor. And I've started learning more and more about that part of it. And my only problem is, do you call all that the Big Bend, or there's always hair splitting about the Trans-Pecos? Is the Trans-Pecos the high?
Well, let's go ahead and split some hairs right here.
No, I don't know what you call it, or I do like the be-all description of far west Texas, because, yeah, there's West Texas, and then this is really far west Texas. And it's not like the rest of West
Right.
Texas. I mean,
And anything with the word far in it just kind of sounds better, too.
no, seriously, if I look at it from that perspective, going north, once you hit Stockton, you're out of wherever you were. You're not in the Big Bend.
Unless you live there.
But conversely, once you hit Stockton going west on I-10, or even better, once you get past Langtree on US 90, there is this feeling. I mean, with from Fort Stockton to Alpine to Marathon or going out to Balmoral, there's just a point where I start going like, and I can exhale. And it's just different.
It's not flat anymore.
That's part of it.
Well,
There's some traffic.
Yeah. I mean, I almost feel silly asking you this question, Ranger Paredes, having spent so many hours and so many full days there and logged so much time in the park. But can you take us back to some of your earliest experiences with the place and how it, how you first experienced it?
I was thinking about that as folks were talking here, and I realized that I'm still experiencing it. That first trip has never ended, and I'm still on it.
That's a damn fine answer. Tell us. I mean, everybody here probably has an idea of what it means to work as a river ranger in the park, but I mean, their ideas of many of us might not match up with reality. Can you talk a little bit about, when you retired last summer, right? After about 2 decades, was it?
That's correct. Yeah.
And can you just kind of give us a picture so that we can all dream about it of what a day in your life during those 2 decades was like?
Well, I still can't believe they paid me to do that. Just to back up a little bit, I started out as
Can you speak just a little closer to the mic so the folks in the back?
certainly. Is that better?
Yeah.
I started out as a guide down there, a river guide, and I did that for 10 years. And I outfitted horse trips as well, up into the Carmens. I took Laurence on one of his early trips up there, our early trips up there. And one day the park offered me actually what they said was, we're looking for somebody to fill this river ranger's job. And I told them, I said, well, I know a few guys that would probably be really good for that, and I can put them in touch with you if you want. And this was Jim Carrico, the best superintendent we ever had there. He told me, he said, well, we were wondering if you'd be interested. And I told him, I said, no, I've got a job. I'm doing all right. And of course, my wife was about that big around back then, and I told her about this, and she said, you go back and tell that nice man that you want to talk about it. And that was really how I started working for the Park Service, and I realized
How old were you at that point?
oh, hell, I don't...
I mean,
26, 27,
Wow.
something like that, I reckon. I'm probably a little bit older, but I realized that it was basically doing what I had been enjoying doing for years, except it actually had a paycheck and some benefits that went with it. And of course, it was really doing what I enjoyed doing, and that was being outdoors. I think the first couple
Tell
of
us what you
years-
said this morning, that you did nothing.
That's exactly right. She asked me, she said, well, what is a park ranger's, we were talking about what a park ranger's job is, and I told her to really simplify it. In a nutshell, a park ranger's job is to do nothing, and furthermore, to make sure that nothing happens.
that's fantastic.
It is not ours to go out there and develop the parks or build things or take things down. It is to make sure that they stay pretty much the way they are. And so that's what I'd always told folks. Our job is to do nothing and make sure nothing happens.
Now, I read somewhere a newspaper article where someone quoted you as saying that your first boss was the Rio Grande, and only after that was your next boss was the National Park Service. So
Well-
my question to you is, was the Rio Grande a pretty good boss?
It put my kid through college. And I had some great times out there. But yeah, that is something that I have always tried to keep in perspective. And all of the guys that I had working under me, I told them the same thing. And that was to remember that we don't work for the National Park Service, we work for the national parks. That is our job, you know. And sometimes the National Park Service will forget that. And we need to just remind ourselves that that is really what we're there for, is to look out for the national parks.
So I want to come back to you, Laurence, but also to you, Joe Nick, because and we'll sort of stay on this theme of the park and of your career there, Ranger Paredes, because both of you have gone on many trips over the years and have been guided by Ranger Paredes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about.
Marcos is good. I'm not even.
Okay, all right,
ranger
fair
anymore.
enough. All right, we'll go there. You-
Ex-ranger, yeah.
Talk a little bit about your experience going on guided trips with Marcos and into the park and what he's shown you there. I think people would like to hear that.
Well, I live to tell about the experience.
Yeah.
Nothing happened, which is what he likes. Because when something happens, you end up in a chapter of my book in Death in Big Bend.
Yeah. Well, we should say that that Lawrence's book, Death in Big Bend, which is from last spring, came out
Last summer,
Last
yeah.
summer. Okay. Which is about 10 to 15 accounts of.
Yeah, 17 accounts
17
of
accounts.
rescues and fatalities in the park. And unfortunately, Marcos is one of the big stars of the book because he got to deal with it when something happened.
Right, I was going to say that's when something did happen, right? So, so since you brought up the book, let's talk a little bit, since Marcos is a big character in the book, and obviously the park is, about how that book came about, and why, having spent so much time photographing the park and writing about the park in other ways, you felt it was time to write a book about people dying in the park.
Well, I grew up in the Park Service, so I always knew a lot of rangers, and they tend to move around a lot from park to park. And some rangers that I knew as a kid were at Big Bend, like Charlie Peterson and others. And so I just sort of got pulled into the park culture there a little and knew and still know a lot of the rangers there and got to know Marcos, I think, particularly once we did a river trip together, if I remember right, and then the Sierra del Carmen trip. But anyhow, I usually do these guidebooks and the pretty photos and all that. One day I was just sort of like tired of that and said, I need to do something different before I get bored here. So, some of the rangers had told me some of the stories of mishaps and incidents and murders and what have you that have happened at the park over the years. In fact, I even got sucked in and helped in on a rescue. And it just sort of occurred to me, well, I should do this book. And the rangers out there knew me well enough to know that if they gave me access to the files, I wouldn't just totally screw the project up. So the park was great and just said, well, here are the files, knock yourself out. And the book came to pass.
So, what can you share with the audience here? Maybe one of the stories from that book that's kind of stuck with you.
I think the hardest part about doing the book was calling family members who'd lost a family member at the park. You'd have to just cold call them and say, well, remember when your dad died 10 years ago at Big Bend? Can you talk to me about it? They're like, who are you? He's been a reporter. He probably knows what I mean. And, you sort of get used to it, but you sort of don't. And after a couple minutes, the people would realize, okay, I was legit. And then the dam would break, and I was kind of like another shoulder to cry on. I knew I might have had 2 questions for the person, but it'd be a 45-minute phone call every time. So it was kind of interesting in that regard. I think the incident that bothered me the most, and I think is the one where the 5-year-old girl and her father were murdered down at Solis on the River Road. It was never solved. I talked to the mother at length more than once. That was probably the actual single hardest phone call. What do you do? Call up and say, well, you lost your 5-year-old daughter. Can you tell me about it? But, I was more tactful than that. But nonetheless, it was a tough phone call. So that was probably one of the hardest incidents. people, of course, are going to look at this book and go, oh my God, people are dying of everything. Well, actually, car wrecks and heart attacks are what they mostly die of out there. But through just bad luck, dumb decisions, what have you, people have died there freezing to death. Heat stroke, of course. Heat is a big factor. Marcos has sure been involved in some of those. Drownings used to be more common, but the river in recent years just is not much of a river, so the drownings have mostly gone away. Falls. There was an assisted suicide in the park, basically, which is it's probably the most bizarre story in there. A man from San Antonio wanted to commit suicide, but he couldn't quite do it himself, so he kept trying to talk people into taking him out to Big Bend and killing him there. In fact, he made a trip out there, dug a shallow grave about a mile from the old Ore Road out in the middle of the desert, and finally talked this sort of gullible kid, 18-year-old kid, into going out there and killing him. And he wanted to be staked out and gutted alive, was how he wanted to be killed. And the kid just couldn't do it. At least he, drew the line somewhere, and he finally whacked him over the head with a shovel a couple times. But that didn't do it, and he finally couldn't do it anymore, so they got in the car and drove back. And
With the terror.
And the guy that was supposed to be dead was really depressed because he wasn't dead. I mean, it's sort of funny, but not really.
And must have had a terrible headache as well.
Yeah, and he had a real headache, and they went to this party that night after getting back, and he had this bruise and blood coming down. What happened? Well, I fell. And anyhow, a couple weeks later, they went back out, and the kid kind of made good this time. But anyhow, so that was probably the weirdest story.
I'll say.
But a lot of it was sad, though. I mean, really, a lot of it was sad. A lot of it's unnecessary or just, tragic, really.
I will tell you another part of that, and that was how this particular guy was discovered.
Oh, yeah, that's funny.
Please tell
It
us.
was, we had a load pulled over, a load of dope one night, and the guys bailed. Bolted when they got stopped. They'll often do that, take off running. And they called me that night and asked me to get ready to go track in the morning. And I got up before daybreak and loaded the horse up and went out to try to track these guys.
Helicopters, Border Patrol, Park
They had Border
Rangers,
Patrol,
everybody.
They had folks out there. And I picked up some tracks, headed out to an old dried out stock tank, and was circling this stock tank when where I could see some tracks leading off from, and when one of the Border Patrol guys came up, and he walked out into the stock tank and he says, "Hey, what have we got here?" And I rode down in there and looked, and there was a part of looked like an old Mexican blanket sticking out of the ground. And then we saw a bone near it. And then we realized that this was, as we dug around and pulled on it a little bit, it was something buried in this blanket wrapped in chicken wire. And it turned out to be, we found another bone and we realized we were looking at a burial here. And so
Fairly recent.
we lost one body off in the desert and found another one.
Yeah, the drug smuggler got lucky. He got forgotten. He was gone.
He was all of a sudden, the guy who bolted from the vehicle was no longer a priority. We haven't found him yet. We will.
So I think it's funny that we've pretty quickly begun talking about the sort of dark humor of Big Bend and the way that bad stuff can happen out there, which makes me think of the title of your book, Dr. Nelson, which was God's Country or the Devil's Playground. So my question to you is, which is it?
Well, I'm a teacher. I teach English at Sul Ross State University. So, and one of the things that fascinates me is Eastern religions. So I would say it's both. And I don't know how to follow anything that they've said because my book is very boring in comparison. It's talking about literature and kind of tries to explain how to read stories, but it's also how to listen to stories that people tell, and then figure out some of the maybe motives or I don't know, anyway, investigates a little bit about how stories affect the reader or the listener.
You could say God's playground if you remembered to bring water in your pack, and Devil's
Right,
playground
right.
if you didn't, or something.
But I mean, beyond just the challenges in terms of the heat and all of that the area presents to a traveler, and heat stroke and all of that. I mean, there's another reason why over time people have wondered whether the devil actually makes his home out in that part of the country. I'm thinking of the Aristeo Brito novel, The Devil in Texas, and the many legends about how the devil makes his home in the cave above Ojinaga and all of that. I wonder, Joe, Nick, you know many of those stories. You probably know all those stories.
I don't know many of them, but I do know the Devil's Swing, which is specific to Ojinaga and I guess the Presidio area. I think it's just, it's both. It's hellish country, but it's also very abundant if you know how to look and where to look. One of Dr. Nelson's proteges, David Alloway, instructed me on desert survival training. I used to have, I had all kinds of phobias most people do about deserts. It's a harsh, foreboding place, and you don't want to get caught out there without plenty of supplies. And David showed me how abundant the desert was and how easily you could live in that environment. And it really just changed my way of thinking. Along with a fellow down in Laredo, a ethnobotanist and a curandero named Tony Ramirez. Both David and Tony taught me that what looks like badass plants are actually very giving and productive. You just have to know how to adapt to it. And as a city person, I always have kind of the tourist take on the Big Bend. And Dr. Nelson and Marcos are locals. They've learned to adapt and survive and are very nimble. I've learned to watch people like them when I'm out there because they know their way around. And to me, 2006 is when Marcos was doing a trip along with Mike Ryan as river rangers, and a few folks got to tag along, and this was the end of my last piece of reporting for a story I did in National Geographic called Border Beauty. And it was looking at all the conservation strategies on both sides of that river. We always look at it, it's Texas, it's north of the Rio Grande, and we don't look at it as the Rio Bravo or this. The river is really the connector of all this area. And if you can get over the fact that there is a border and some stupid people are in charge of trying to enforce both sides of those borders, this is a tremendous ecosystem, and it's a tremendous wilderness. And the trip I took with Marcos to get him to watch what he did, checking on burns to see if some prescribed burns were knocking down invasive giant cane, and talking about salt cedar and how do you eradicate salt cedar, how do you bring back cottonwood, how the river's changed in 30 years. Everything was a lesson. And I picked up on lingo. I know what a UDA is. It's undocumented alien. And that's such a better term than mojado or wetback, I think. But what was amazing is, I can't remember, it was 6 or 7 days on the river, a 60-mile stretch, and that really is the wildest. It's the great wilderness river trip in this part of the world. If you can go, it's below the national park. I'd done all the other canyons. I hadn't done the lower canyons. And it was wonderful because the only people we saw on this entire trip was an airplane circling overhead, and they were park people that he could talk to. And they were just checking on us, but we didn't see another person. There were no planes in the flight pattern overhead because that wasn't part of a flight pattern. And it's hard to find places like that. But boy, to be on it and to be on that river and get to discover all the hot springs and hear stories, it was the perfect ending to all my research for that article. And it really did. It convinced me once again that river is the ribbon that ties it all together. It's not a border. And it's not a barrier. It's the lifeblood of whatever we know as the Big Bend.
Marcos, can I get you to I mean, you know, I know that obviously the park is full of so much beauty, but I wonder when people talk about this idea of, you know, Devil's Playground, what that sounds like to you who spent so much time there in the park.
Well, first I want to back up for just a second because Barney made a comment that was inaccurate when she said that compared to Lawrence's book, hers was boring because it is.
Yeah.
It is a compilation
Well said.
of some of the finest stories of the Big Bend I've ever read. I recently had some friends that were on their way to Guadalupe, and they said, well, what can you tell us about Guadalupe? And I pulled her book out and I said, read this story right here, God's Country. And that was enough for them, and they took that. And when they handed it back to me, I reread the story of the Candelia workers over there on the river. And then I saw David Alloway's story in there, where rainbows wait for rain. And Robert Hill's account of his first trip down the Rio Grande. And so it's a great book.
You're about to go on.
I'm about to
Come hither.
He's survived 2 decades in Big Bend National Park, only to.
I told you.
I have fallen further. But to get back to your question, Joe Nick was really touching on something that is really near to my heart here when he was talking about the river and how it really unites all of these areas. And this is something that I have been trying to convey to folks for years, is that a lot of folks don't pick up on this right away, but out there in West Texas, we have more land set aside than the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It is a huge chunk of land that has been protected in the last 2 decades. And that includes on both sides of the river. You know, we're talking about the Shinati Mountains, El Mezquital, the Ocotillo Wildlife Refuge, Elephant Mountain, the Black Gap Wildlife Management Area, Big Brushy Canyon, the Rio Grande Wild and Scenic River,
Big Bend
Big Bend
Ranch.
Ranch State Park, Big Bend National Park, the Maderas del Carmen Protected Area, the El Campo Reserve, and the Santa Elena Reserve. Huge, 300 million acres of lands that have been set aside and protected in my short, puny little lifetime. And the one thing that they all have in common, all those places that I just mentioned, maybe excluding 1 or 2 like Elephant Mountain, which is a little north, but the one thing that almost all of those areas have in common is that they are united by the river. That is the common thread that weaves through all of them. And there has been recent talk about this binational park, or binational area of interest, or international park, or whatever they choose to call it on that particular day. But what I keep coming back to is that what we really need to do is to be able to manage the river jointly. You know, if we cannot have a binational river, if we cannot, between the United States and Mexico, manage the waters and the natural resources of the Rio Grande jointly, which is where all of these areas come together, then we have no business looking beyond that. And so this is what I promote every time that somebody says anything about a binational area. I say, well, let's back up a little and look at a binational river.
And yet today, you're not supposed to camp on the right side of the river if you're going downstream.
I would just as soon not get into that conversation because I don't believe it's true. I believe that according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that you can camp on either side of the river.
That's why I want to go downstream with you.
I am not a lawyer. I know there are a few out there. So tell me if I'm right or wrong. Treaty trumps law. Is that true or
Any
false?
lawyers want to speak to that?
Well, a treaty is a law, sort of. I mean,
Negative. It is a contractual agreement between two sovereign nations.
but it usually sets up laws.
But anyway, I go by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I will go down that river and camp wherever I please. I'm done with that.
Well, I want to cycle back to something, Joe, Nick, you were saying that it's a dangerous area, but of course it's full of, if you know what plants can be helpful, there's all sorts of elements that are there to actually help out a traveler. And Dr. Nelson, in the introduction to your book, which I will agree with Marcos is by no means dull, is actually a great book. And one of the things I liked is the introduction, where you talk about all those plants that were mailed to you in that box. And as I was reading that, I was thinking that you must have, it's true, there are so many plants that are out there that can be helpful. There are also so many plants out there that can be very harmful. And so I wondered if you, I'm sure that you must have a plant that you dislike the most. Probably a cactus of some kind, probably something that's crippled a horse or two.
Lechugia.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I feel certain that you do have a plant out there in the area that you really feel a passionate dislike for.
I guess loco weed would be that plant.
Yeah.
But I'll go back to your other question, because I can't make a big story out of that. About
Well,
the reason I chose the Devil's Playground as part of my title was because, and Marcus and I talked about this at breakfast too, some of us there, we have mixed emotions about tourism, because what tourism really does to a community is create service jobs. You know, somebody to clean the toilet, somebody to make the bed, somebody to serve the food and all that sort of thing. So, you know, we love the Big Bend area, we love the beauty of the mountains, we need the money of tourists coming through and all that sort of thing. But like he said, he didn't want his son to grow up and have a service job. You know, he wanted him to have more opportunities than that, but we want to stay there. And so that's where the Devil's Playground business comes in. It's a mix of what's, you know, there's no good answer. I have no answers. I just bring up questions.
so when you use the term the Devil's Playground, you're thinking more contemporary in terms of
I'm
the
thinking more
challenges
of
that.
devils as tourists or people that.
Tell us what you really think.
Now you see why I didn't want to sign the release.
Has there been an increase in the number of devils that are in the area?
Yes, and these guys are doing it. No, but when, for instance, we have a big chili cook-off there in Terlingua every year. And again, I'm sure people need the money, and it's a good thing. But people that come kind of tend to feel like they can do anything they want to do in our part of the world. You know, they can leave their manners behind. They can come out there and just have sex, you know, put on a white T-shirt and have somebody spray them with water. Well, we don't act that way. Or maybe Marcus does. I don't know.
Well, not to split hairs, but that's all behind the store. And the Cassie folks are different.
I've never been, so.
One year I got to judge, and my friend Kirby Warnock came and judged. He judged behind the store, and I went to Cassie, and it was terrible that, and I've judged Wild Hog. I still do the Go Cook-Off up in Brady. But tepid chili at 4 p.m. after you've been around all these drunks and you're feeling a little fuzzy yourself is not my idea of a good time. And then when I went and picked up Kirby, everybody was still flashing. They were yeehawing, and it looked like it was a lot more fun there. But those cook-offs is what really started modern tourism in a lot of ways in that part, in the Terlingua area. Back when H. Allen Smith and Frank X. Tolbert were doing newspaper columns and throwing down challenges. And, you know, it must have been fun for them the first time or two. But what I saw at that, when I went a few years ago, is kind of like after the first few years of South by Southwest this year. And it's like, you know, I don't know, the crowds are a little bit too much. And It's a little too regimented wildness. If I want to have a good time, I'd rather do it with a handful of people.
So Marcos, I mean, you're in an interesting situation because I'm sure that you must, to some extent, share some of what Dr. Nelson's complaints are about hordes of people coming in and acting crazy and all that. But on the other hand, part of your job has been to help those people find their way in the park and to get them out of trouble when they get into trouble. So do you share her view of the kind of the ambivalence toward the folks from the outside coming in?
I don't have any ambivalence, but I do agree with some of the things that she's saying. And what we were speaking about this morning is really the need to have a more diverse economy in an area like the Big Bend. That, you know, we cannot and should not put all of our eggs in the tourism basket. You know, we need to develop other cottage industries and businesses and things that provide some better employment opportunities for folks. Tourism should be one component of our economy there. And I don't think that Barney or I, either one, like to see you know, everything concentrated on a tourism-based industry there. There are some works that have been done in other areas. There's a book called Balancing Nature and Commerce in the Gateway Communities that was done by the Sonoran Institute some years back, and it looks at this problem of gateway communities where people are coming in and developing these areas, and what you end up with is a service. Well, here's the great example: is Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
You're gonna say
Okay?
Jackson.
Where the people who were born and raised there now live in Driggs because they can no longer afford the taxes or the houses there in Jackson Hole, and the only thing they have to go back there for is service industry jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that the folks there in our local government will have the foresight to see that we need to have a little more diverse economy.
Lawrence, I want to throw that over to you because you've worked as a photographer in a lot of these so-called gateway communities around the country, around the world. I mean, you've taken photographs in so many of these places. I wonder if some of the things that Marcos is talking about are things you recognize from some of the other national parks that and the communities around them that you've worked in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Tourists are a blessing and a curse. It's kind of a
That's correct.
mixed deal. They do bring in money and jobs, and maybe not the greatest jobs, but it might be better than no jobs. You know, if you grew up around there, that's maybe better than nothing. People, maybe a few think Big Bend's overrun with tourists, but those people have not been to Yellowstone or Yosemite or Great Smokies and Fall Color or some of the things I've kind of held my nose and made myself do. It took me a long time. I've shot in about every national park over the years. It took me a long time before I braved Yosemite, and my wife and I finally said, okay, we got to battle the crowds and go. So we went. And actually, it's a beautiful place. I'm glad we went. I've been back since. But Big Bend actually is pretty quiet. It's a big park and not a lot of people. And if you don't go at spring break or between Christmas and New Year's, you know, it's generally not too bad. I don't think Big Bend's in danger of being overwhelmed with tourists. I actually, these days, am somewhat concerned. You know, you kind of hear the endless news pieces that the national parks are being loved to death. But actually, overall, system-wide, national park tourism has been falling steadily for years. I guess because of changing demographics, changing lifestyle. People would rather play video games. I don't know. You know, they can see the park on the internet. Why go? I mean, I don't know. But it's tough. Jackson, Wyoming is probably the quintessential over-the-top case, which is why I thought you'd say it. Plus, of course, we've met up there before when you've been stationed up there. But I don't know. It is nice to have a more diverse economy. I grew up in large part of Carlsbad Caverns, and Carlsbad was sort of the gateway community, and tourism was part of it, but they also had potash mining and oil and gas and ranching, so it was not near as one-sided a community. Jackson, Wyoming, either you're in a service job or you're a multimillionaire and you just come in and spend a few weeks there a year in your trophy house. I mean, that's sort of Jackson, Wyoming, but not that it's not a beautiful place, and I can see why people would want their trophy house there. But I don't know. I don't really know what the solution is. I mean, as Barney was saying, it'd be nice to have some other kind of industry in Alpine, but the question is what? That's the question facing every city, big and little, in this
Yeah,
country.
do you do the bentonite plant? Do you do a prison? That seems to be the small town economy salvation of most of Texas. And frankly, I think I'd rather not see that in your area. You may say, we need a prison. It's what kind of economy? I think, relatively speaking, the visitation, the impact is very light at this point. And you're right to be talking about it now, because
Exactly.
maybe 20 years down the line, it's going to become a bigger issue. But except for chili cook-off weekend and spring break, I don't see a whole lot of that being loved to death that I see in other places. And in fact, it's the one place that seems to be able to handle people getting away from it all. To me, the good news is it's not the kind of tourists that at the Grand Canyon, you go to Tusayan, you go beyond, people get out of their car, they look over that big ditch, and they get back in their car and they're gone. Big Bend is too hard to get to. It's a pain in the ass, and most people won't do it. That's why I don't feel too intimidated about writing about it. I think it's okay. I think when we walked across Big Bend National Park from Rio Grande Village to Lajitas, we wrote about it. I don't think a whole lot of people picked up that issue of Parks and Wildlife and said, let's do this.
They were smart.
If we do a service, it's we let people live vicariously through our stupidity.
Well, I'm glad you brought that trip up, Joe Nick, because I wanted to ask you and Laurence to just kind of quickly tell the story of that epic voyage.
Oh, God.
Yeah, what started it? I'm still trying to remember.
I think I somehow hatched up the idea, and I said, hey, Joe Nick, we ought to hike across the park. And I was thinking, surely he's going to talk me out of this idea. He goes,
Yeah.
yeah, let's do it. I'm like, oh, no. Now I got to go.
No, it was a defining trip. I mean, it was really hard. We did a lot of fudging. How many people did we have?
6.
6. So, but we had Desert Sports, a semi-sag wagon. For the first 2 days, they showed up at the end of the day with water and basically checking on us. We all still want to do this? And every day there was a check, would we press on? And after about the 3rd day, every day there was a reason to consider, do we keep doing this? Until the last day, when I really thought you'd lost the bottom of the soles of your feet, you were bleeding and sick, and you knew the route, such as it was. No one knew the route, really. But that was before we climbed
So
up
I had to go.
on the Mesa de Anguilla, which was just nuts.
Yeah, that was a hard day. That was tough.
But it was a throwdown. Could we do this? And we could.
We all did. All of us.
And it was really hard, but it was really fun, and it felt great all the way to almost the very end on the lookout. We were on this huge mesa, the most isolated part of the national park, and we're fixing to go down into Lajitas, which is like golf course, and it's fake. It's a fake town, a fake place. And we thought about, well, should we just turn around right here? But no, we went down, and then we got picked up by Jim Carico, who Marcos is right. I mean, Jim Carico was the Big Bend National Park superintendent. He was one of the first superintendents, if not the first, of the state ranch. And I think he was ready to give Ed Abbey a job in Big Bend before Ed died. He was coming to Big Bend. That's the kind of guy Jim Carico is. And he's co-owner of Desert Sports. I always recommend trading with him when you're down there if you have a reason. But that trip was just great.
2 of the people that went that hike were a couple pretty attractive women, I think at that point in their early 30s. And they showed up Desert Sports, like he was saying, they dropped some resupply stuff for us a couple of times along the way where we crossed roads. But anyhow, these 2 friends of ours came, real, pretty cute women, and so I had photo models. But they came into Desert Sports, and they could really dress up and be like city girls. They come in these cute little outfits, and they pull up in their little red BMW car, and they walk into Desert Sports. And Mike Long, the owner there, is kind of this crusty, kind of quiet sort of guy, and he kind of looks at him, goes, you girls know what you're getting into? They go, oh, yeah. And actually, they were actually very fit women. They were fine. But so, of course, at the end of the trip, what they had to do is walk right in there and say, well, we made it, didn't we? So he's like,
Yeah, I
guess
remember
you did."
being back at Desert Sports. It really smelled like goats. It was torn to shit. And the biggest compliment is a friend of mine from Austin, Jamie Mitchell, had gone into there, and he was going on some kind of adventure. But he walked past me, and then he did a double take. He looked back, and he kind of squinted his eyes. He said, "Are you Joe Nick?" I said, "Yeah." And I really felt rode hard and put up wet, but that's why you do those things.
We were pretty rank.
I don't want to take too much away from that, but I got to tell
Try
you.
buy a local.
I got to tell you that I've seen 100 foreign exchange students do that hike carrying nothing but a Clorox bottle wrapped in burlap.
Is that a little
What he means by foreign
exaggeration?
exchange students is foreign exchange students.
Well, we did see some tracks from San Vicente headed north. In fact, a whole bunch of tracks. We knew we weren't alone. That's true.
You want to hear a real adventure? I can tell you about my daughter and I driving around San Marcos.
Trying to park here?
So I'm interested to ask then, to cycle back a couple questions when you were talking about
Sorry, Nick.
That's too easy. About tourism and the future of the park in the area. And Dr. Nelson, I wanted to ask you, aside from you worked on this book, much of which was about the writing was about conservation in that book, or about writing about nature in that book. And I wonder if, aside from the chili cook-off, what do you see as the greatest threat to the area in the future? What is the thing that concerns you when you think about the land and the area sort of continuing as it has been?
We talked about this at breakfast too. Y'all should have been at breakfast. I guess we kind of agree that my greatest fear is for people to come there that think they know how it should be and do something that really does change it. Because all of that used to be underwater. So, when you start talking about native or non-native species, if it used to be an ocean, just where do you draw the line there? And so sometimes when people want to do something, they get very passionate about what it is they want to do. And for instance, one of there's an endangered species called the Terlingua cat's eye, or that it's okay to go park your RVs there, and as long as you're drinking beer, we don't worry about the Terlingua cat's eye. But otherwise, everybody gets real worried about those things and wants to do something. And they don't always do the right thing.
So, that dynamic of people not from the outside coming in and thinking that they know what's best for the area.
Yeah, and it's not just them, but locals don't always know what's best either. But people, it seems like the less somebody knows, and that's one of the things that I tell my students. Say, when you're 18 and you come in here as a freshman, you've got all the answers. And when you're educated and you leave here as a graduate, when somebody asks you a question, I want you to say, I don't know.
So that seems like it gets us back to what Marcos said his job was, doing nothing and making sure nothing happens, that there's a kind of circularity to that. What about you, Marcos? You were talking about that at breakfast, so I know you've thought about it, but when you think about the future of the area and the greatest threats that it faces, what do you think of?
I would say politics is probably the biggest single threat that area faces every day. People's perceptions, the way that folks who have never been to the border perceive the border, I think has a huge impact on it.
So specifically, you're talking about politics as they regarding the border and immigration right now.
That's correct.
What do you, in that realm, what do you fear? Do you fear the militarization of the border? Is that what you're thinking of?
I think that that's a potential, although what I really try to keep in mind is that, you know, I try to keep a broad perspective, and I realize that none of this is new. This is a pendulum that swings back and forth. You know, Camp Santa Elena was a military camp, you know. The military's been there before. We've had these fears before, you know. During the Escobar uprising, Johnson's Ranch was developed. It was the largest airfield in Texas, you know. We were protecting ourselves from the folks south of us, you know. Some folks don't realize that probably the first aerial bombing campaigns and the first air-to-air combat occurred over the Big Bend, you know, during that time frame. So, yeah, militarization is certainly a consideration, and it's something that I wouldn't be surprised to see in the near future. But like I say, it's a pendulum that swings back and forth. Eventually we come back to our senses and realize that, you know, our cousins over there are not very different from us.
Since we're talking a little bit about the border, and I wanted to talk about the Boquillas crossing, when that was shut and what that meant for the area and the you know, sort of what it meant in a bigger sense. I don't mean what it meant in terms of logistics. I mean what it meant in a bigger sense when that happened.
Well, of course, the obvious thing I think that most folks are aware of is that we cut off the lifeblood of those communities. They were as dependent on tourism as the folks in Terlingua and Alpine and Studi Butte are. That was their, you know, that was what they depended on, and we cut them off and left them high and dry. And of course, you know that there's a move now to
reopen it,
the crossing.
Yeah, and how is that?
By this time next year, it should be open.
That's great. And who are the prime agents behind making that happen?
Probably the same folks that were behind closing. I mean, truth be known, you know, although they didn't exist then, the Department of Homeland Security was Customs and Border Patrol. That, along with the Park Service, you know, all of these federal agencies really had a hand in shutting it down, and they are all involved in opening it back up. We have formed a group recently. When we heard that they were opening up, we felt like that's great that they're going to open the crossing, but we believe that it's really important for that crossing when it opens to succeed. And so we formed a little group that is trying to not only act as an advisory group, but also try to come up with some funding to provide some microloans to some of the folks over there for reestablishing their businesses, for getting inventory, fixing up the infrastructure, doing some guide training, getting them ready for some ecotourism, and so that when the crossing opens, they're ready to have visitors come over, so that when the crossing opens, people don't go over there and find that there's nothing to do or nowhere to go. Right. So that's one of the things that we're working on right now, is trying to get a little funding to get the community of Boquillas prepared for opening up again.
That's fantastic. So I wanted to, we're going to have the chance for all of you to ask questions to these folks up here, and I want to make sure we have a chance to do that. So we're going to wrap up our us talking, or me asking you all questions. But I just wanted to quickly ask the four of you to talk about the place that, your favorite place in the park, the place that, and I know you're going to say, well, that's like trying to choose between your favorite children or something, right?
That is exactly what I was going to say.
But you know, that's an acceptable answer, I suppose. But I think people would like to hear where you all want to go back to most when you're away.
Don't all jump in at once.
Go ahead, Laurence. You start.
I probably seems like lately, maybe because I realize one of these days my knees won't do the job anymore, but I seem to be doing a lot of hard off-trail stuff. Maybe it started with that crazy hike we did, but I really like some of the really remote parts off and off-trail in the park, like top of Casa Grande or Cattail Canyon, or some of the sort of places you really don't want to break an ankle because it's going to be really, really hard to get out or have anyone else help you get out. But the park in general is not overrun with people, but some of the really remote spots, there really is nobody.
Inside any canyon on the river. And if I had to choose one, probably Santa Elena, just to be there and be with those walls up above you. And then climbing up to the rim, anywhere in the Chisos on the rim, just where you get those views that you can see all the way to tomorrow. And even on even when it's polluted, and that seems to be happening more and more, visibility is not as good as it used to be, but there's something about even the smog or the haze that comes in, just being able to see that far and to see ranges beyond ranges. It's hard to do. There's no easy way to do it. You can't take an elevator. You can't ride a horse anymore unless you bring your own. But if you can get up top, man, there's not views like that just about anywhere else.
I do have a special place that is down Terlingua Creek. You take the road down Terlingua Creek to where the road ends, and it's right up against the park boundary, and there's a little corner there where you can still see no lights, no houses, no fences, except mine.
Uh-huh.
I'll change my definition back to the Big Bend as I see it. And there's a place up on the 06 Ranch that has a pour-off real similar to the window, and it's not as dramatic a view quite, but you can see a long way, and there's no lights, and there's no fences. The outside fence of the ranch on that side is all rimrock, and so it's my favorite place. And whenever I've ever been there, I've been usually the only person or with my own family, and that's my beautiful daughter back there standing in the back. Duck down.
She just ducked down.
There she is.
Yes, Mark.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
I'm all done.
Well, then I'm gonna. I want to throw it open to questions. Yes.
Referring to aerial warfare and exercises and bombardment, what period of time?
That was
Mexican Revolution, wasn't it?
well, it was
1910 to
the Escobar
1916,
uprising, 19.
16 or
I
thereabouts,
was
wasn't
thinking
it?
11, but
Yeah, somewhere in that range.
The revolutionaries there hired American mercenary pilots to drop pipe bombs on the federales. And so these American pilots, for pay, were flying along and with a cigar in their mouth, dropping these pipe bombs. And the Mexican government got upset. They cried foul and insisted that the United States stop these American mercenaries. And so the U.S. sent the Army Air Corps down to Johnson's Ranch, where they set up, and they patrolled the river for these mercenaries. And of course, when they came up on them, they chased them and shot at them from the plane with their carbines, which really technically was the first air-to-air combat.
Other questions? Yeah. Yes, right here in the front.
Have there been any problems with any of the drug smuggling in that area?
No, they're doing fine. They're not having any problems. I will tell you what my perception is on that, and I think I have a pretty good perspective. I've patrolled the river for a long time, and I see the actual tracks in the sand. And I don't think that the contraband activity has increased a whit in the last 2 decades. We have got better at catching them because there are a lot more folks out there. Now, basically, the Border Patrol, they can just kind of hold hands, reach out and create a human chain. But we have got, so they have picked up more. And some folks would say, oh, there's a lot more smuggling going on. But I would say, no, we're just catching a lot more of them now. I don't think that there was suddenly a huge spike or demand for drugs in this country in the last decade. I think the demand has probably remained the same, and the same amount has been coming across. But as you have more manpower out there, you catch more of them. All of that.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you your favorite place.
Oh, my favorite place, huh? Oh, well, put me on the spot. There's a couple spots I like the highways out there, actually, which is kind of crazy to say. But some of the best thinking I've ever gotten done is when I'm all alone in a car, just rolling down like 67, let's say, and there's not another car, you're not going to pass another car except once every 25 minutes or so. And to me, there's just something beautiful about a 2-lane highway, especially when there's no other cars but me on it. So there's a couple spots, a couple bends in the road down there going from, say, Marfa down to Presidio that I go back to in my mind.
Lincoln's profile.
Yeah, that's one.
Lincoln's profile.
Yes, sir.
I was thinking about the comments that were made about change in the Big Bend and the idea of developing an economy there that would have good jobs that the people who are local would want to do. And I wonder how much change would the panel be willing to accept in exchange for those jobs? Seems there's a conflict there.
Yeah, I'll try to answer. I'm not sure we want any more, That's another thing we talked about at breakfast, and Marcus had a great word for it.
No tourists, no nothing.
It's called the last
Last settler syndrome.
last settler syndrome. We'd like the door to close behind us. But we have a pretty stable community. We have a low, Presidio has a high unemployment rate, but Alpine doesn't. We're pretty stable, and we have the university there. We have the college. We have 12,000 different law enforcement agencies, right?
Yeah, there's your economic engine
Yeah.
now, is
Border Patrol.
the federal government, for better or for worse.
That's a big one. I am seeing that there is a lot of stuff happening out there. That there are a lot more people living in the greater Terlingua Studi Butte microplex area now.
Hey, you have a high school now.
I'll talk to folks. I'll be visiting with them at the Starlight or at the store or something, and I'll say, well, what do you do? Are you retired? Are you independently wealthy? What do you? And I'm amazed at the answers that I get, and mostly folks that are working online. I talked to a lady, said, oh yeah, I keep the books for this outfit in New Orleans, and sure, I can do that. She moved here from New Orleans, but they just send her everything over the internet, and there's a guy who does graphic design for the automotive industry. There are all sorts of really bizarre jobs that you would never think of that folks are really doing online. A lot of people that are working out there, living on some remote little place out in the Solitario off the grid on solar power and maintaining the job that they had in San Francisco,
I have seen a lot of that in the last 20 years, it seems like, with broadband accessibility. And it is the one part of Texas where you're seeing some population growth of small towns rather than a decline in population. It's the only part of Texas where small towns are growing that aren't right next to a big city where they're getting becoming new suburbs. And the people that are being attracted there, people like you, Jake, when you came to work at the Sentinel. There's an amazing amount of interesting talent. I've always liked it, the fact that it's so sparsely populated, but everybody's got a good story to tell. And the art of storytelling is not dead. And I think you're seeing a lot of individual creative types where if you can live wherever you want in the world, that's an option now. And it's not the end of the world anymore. It's
correct.
connected, and that may be good, that may be bad. I mean, I'm not sure I like cell service out there.
Yes, sir. And I haven't forgotten you in the back there.
Do you see Shafter development being a good thing or a bad thing for the area?
The silver mines.
Yeah, silver mines. I think what they're mining is investors myself, but we'll see how that plays out.
Okay, yes, there in the back. You've been waiting patiently.
I'll stand up. Texas Monthly that has continuing features over the years about the best hikes in Texas. And if you want to decrease the devils, quit telling everybody to go hike the South Rim.
It's fair enough, but see that we don't publish best kept secrets monthly though.
When the day comes that you have to take a number before you can get on the trail, I think Jake may accommodate you.
I actually go on weekdays in August when all of Texas thinks it's too hot to go. There's actually a little bit of a rainy season there.
There you go.
It's been wonderful.
And it's higher elevation.
Thanks for letting us know.
Sorry, what's that?
Question for Laurence. Sometimes when you look at your photography in Big Bend and you're so happy with your photograph, do you still sometimes think that there's no way I can convey the space and what I'm seeing at this moment, no matter how good this picture is?
Well, I have to look at the photos after the fact to see what really happened. But I get back and say, wow, that was a nice sunset, wasn't it? But no, seriously. Yeah, it never matches reality. I mean, you can have the best photo of the world of Big Bend or Grand Canyon, but it's not the same as being there and getting that three-dimensional feel and the sounds, the smells, everything. I mean, I do my best, but it's not good enough.
Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't Dr. Nelson say that she contributes to the tourism in supporting the Cowboy Poetry Weekend?
Yes, here's one of my friends.
And wouldn't we all be glad to at least have a Hampton Inn and a new Holiday Inn Express going in so that we can get a room? And when we're in competition with the motorcycle clubs.
I'm so glad you came.
And really, you should address the Cowboy Poetry Weekend because it is one of the best things that's going out there that does not have people being sprayed with water.
It's true. There is not currently a wet t-shirt contest portion of the Cowboy Program.
Yes, us crusty old rural women don't go for that kind of stuff.
Yes, yes, sir.
As a ranger, would you comment on the wildlife diversity in the Big Bend area, and do you get involved in wildlife management?
I have been involved in some wildlife management projects over the years, and I am just amazed at how things have improved there over the last few decades, you know. I was working with some folks from Mexico doing some bear surveys in the late 80s and early 90s. And what the guy determined back there after doing his study was that the habitat over there was saturated and that bears would have to leave and go to the Chisos. And 2 years later was when the sow was photographed with the 2 cubs. I can tell you that if you go down the lower canyons right now, tomorrow you can go down there and see desert bighorn, and 10 years ago you could not. There are wild turkeys down there. The beaver population is thriving. I think wildlife diversity and health in the Big Bend area is at an all-time high right now. You know, the Peregrine was delisted not long ago. My job was monitoring those guys for a while. Of course, one of the things that I concluded doing that was that the populations didn't really increase. I just got a lot better at finding them.
Like the Border Patrol. Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. When is the best time to go as a photographer for the kind of light, quality of light and stuff? Is there a particular time in Marcos you probably know? This answer for doing guides too.
I tend to like winter because you get northern fronts and the air clears out. It's gotten hazier and hazier over the years. Ideally with some clouds, some weather going on to get some drama. But generally winter. Late summer can be nice because, you do get thunderstorms and all, but it is hot. Unless you go up high in the mountains, even there it's, you're going to sweat a little. But probably like winter best.
And everything's been covered there photographically.
Yeah, there's always something new. But it gets harder and harder to find something new. You have to work at it harder.
It's not all been covered.
Try for better light. It sort of never ends.
I'll just throw something in here. People used to ask me, because I've been writing about that area for 100 years. I know I don't look that old, but and they would say, "Aren't you going to run out of stories?" Not there. So I think the same is true of photography.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so yes.
This may be a wasted question, but I go back to sort of the beginning and your worst plant, your most tainted plant, and Joe, Nick, your survival kit, and I sort of suspect they're related, not the best plant, but the box that you got of plants.
Thank you for salvaging my question.
Sorry, I didn't think y'all would really be interested. The story behind the box of plants is that I was in Reno at the time and away from that area, and I was already homesick anyway. And so some people that were living on a ranch down there sent me a box of plants from home. And I was working really hard studying Spanish because I've always been a monolingual all my life. And when I was going through that box of plants, and I say this in the introduction, and naming them off and remembering memories and all that kind of stuff, I realized I didn't know any English names for plants from home. I knew only Spanish names, so I called it a monolingual in 2 languages.
Cat claw are nasty, but there's probably something good about them that I've just haven't paid attention to. I used to think
Keep tourists out of canyons.
stepping on lechuguilla, not any fun, but desert survival training, I learned you can cook them, you can bury them, you can strip them, and you can make rope out of them. When you cook them, you cook the lechuguilla hearts, you bury them in the ground like the ancients did, cook them for 24 hours. Artichokes. And I kept thinking that's what the ancient peoples in their communication, what they must have used to say, oh no, artichokes again. Because yucca tastes pretty much the same when you cook them that way.
Tastes like artichoke.
Were you going to add something, Marcos?
No.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I've been going out to Big Bend now for about 28 or 29 years straight, and I've seen great changes taking place out there since I started going. What do each of y'all think are the biggest changes you've seen from the time you went out there from the very beginning to today, and are these changes good or bad?
Less water in the river, bad.
Yeah, the state of the river being, it's not like it was in the 70s. And the militarization, I resent it. And I can't just jump across, pay a boatman to go have lunch in Lajitas, Santa Elena, Boquillas, and get a real binational experience. I feel cheated. My culture, the Borderlands culture, has been politicized and basically beat up for the last 10 years at least. But we'll have new politicians someday.
My biggest problem with what's changed down there is me, because I keep getting older.
I guess you get our final word, Marcos.
I think that I'd have to agree with what Laurence and Nick were saying. It's probably the state of the river. You know, we have overtaxed a finite resource, and there's only so much to go around. It's you know, I've been involved in some river restoration projects for years and years, and in looking at what we could do to try to salvage the river, what the conclusion that we came to one day was that it was no longer possible to do that, that the very best we could hope for was a scaled down replica of what the Rio Grande once was. You know, for the Rio Grande to be what it used to be would involve washing thousands of people away in El Paso and Presidio, and that's just never going to happen again.
Too many people. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. And before you begin applauding for these fine folks, remember they are, some of them are going to be signing books right behind you, so do go over there and purchase their books. And thank you all for coming.